to the December 14th Common Council Workshop this evening. I'll just turn it directly over to the city manager.
And I'm going to turn it over to Mr. John Urban, who will introduce our guests from SRF. John, it's probably best that you've been working closely with them. This is an offshoot of our facility study. It's something that's mandated that I think our guests will talk about tonight, but it's an offshoot, and so we felt you needed to see this before we started working on the next phase with facility. So, Mr. Urban, take it away.
Thanks, Mark. Good afternoon, good evening. So we've been working with SRF for the last several months on this ADA audit. They've been working on this plan, doing site visits of our various public buildings. In a minute, I'll turn it over to Joe Capper from SRF. We want to thank all the departments for their help as we went through these audits. They spent several weeks here going through these and really looking at a variety of items, a variety of areas, and helping us to prioritize where to start on this journey with addressing these various areas of deficiencies that we found. So I'd like to turn it over to Joe Capper, and he's got a PowerPoint. If you need extra copies, we have hard copies of both here. If anyone needs them, I'll be happy to bring them over to you. He's going to go through the executive summary, that document, and as well he's got a PowerPoint he's going to go through on everything. So Joe, can you hear us, and you want to take it away?
Yes, thank you, John. I can hear you and see you. Thank you very much for the introduction as well as the opportunity to present to the group. If I may get some assistance from IT, perhaps. I don't think I have the ability to share content. I just noticed that now, and now I do. Look at that. Okay, great. Thank you so much. So I will put a presentation on the screen here. Hopefully you all can see that. Thank you again. Once again, my name is Joe Capper with SRF Consulting Group. I'm a planner and project manager, and I actually work in our transit planning and design group. But part of what I also do is work with communities on accessibility policy and kind of bring together our civil engineers and design group to do projects a lot like this. So I'm really happy to have the opportunity to present our work to you today, and I'll hopefully leave a decent amount of time for questions to get through some of this material as efficiently as possible. So just very quickly, I'll go over the content of our report, which we're calling the ADA Transition Plan for Public Buildings and Facilities, and let you know what the results were of our review of facilities when we're looking at them in terms of accessibility. Hopefully I'll have some time for question and answers. I'm not sure I'm happy to be interrupted as well as we go, or we can save it until the end. No preference there. And then I'll let you know kind of where we're at in terms of finalizing the document and what our next steps are. So just to get everyone on the same page of why we're doing what we're doing. This facility audit report, we are looking at design guidelines and standards that relate to the Americans with Disabilities Act. So things that are under the purview of that federal law, guidelines determined by the United States Access Board, and we're specifically looking at Title II of ADA, which is basically that section of ADA that relates to public services. So we're looking at the programs and services operated by state and local government, making sure that we're barring discrimination to those services, making sure that if there are accessible features, they're being maintained appropriately, and that we're providing equal access to programs and services. So that is why we're looking at things like public buildings, parks, et cetera. As was mentioned earlier, it is required for local governments or public agencies with 50 or greater employees to have a transition plan, basically a document that we're putting together here that shows where you're at right now and how you're going to achieve ADA compliance. Part of that is a self-evaluation, which is what we're doing with this facility audit. To talk a little bit about what that transition plan includes, like I said, it kind of looks at where you're at right now in terms of compliance and lays a roadmap for how you will achieve compliance. The way we do that is to assess and identify the physical obstacles that may limit accessibility. We describe how you can make those facilities accessible. Part of what we're providing to you are checklists and guidelines and tools that you can use on an ongoing basis as you are doing maintenance and facility improvements. And it also requires a schedule. There is no prescription as far as like, well, in 10 years and 15 years, in 1 year, you need to have everything compliant. It's very much up to, it's something that just must pass a reasonableness test at the local level. And generally we look to capital improvement programs, local initiatives and the like when we're determining that schedule. So that's a little bit of the background on the law and why we're doing what we're doing and kind of the scope of our review. Now I'll talk about what we did over the summer in reviewing all of the facilities and parks. So just so everyone knows what we collected, we looked specifically at public buildings within the city of Oshkosh. That includes the convention center, library, public safety building. It's listed here. I don't need to read it all. It's also in front of you in a packet. We looked at transit facilities and then also every park within the city of Oshkosh with parks, boat launches, fishing piers, things like that. So looking at all the parts of those facilities that are accessible to the public. Again, we're looking at Title II of ADA, which is related to public access. That's the focus of our scope. Did not cover those portions of facilities that are not accessible to the public that might fall under things like employment law or reasonable accommodations or something like that. So just to if we had to identify some themes of what we saw in terms of where some of the deficiencies were, having a sufficient number of accessible parking spaces at various facilities or parks. Some of the things we also noticed when we looked at parking lots is that the slope of parking spaces and access aisles were greater than 2% in any direction. That is a compliance issue. A lot of the entrance doors to facilities required more than 5 pounds to open and did not take at least 5 seconds to close. Again, accessible parking stalls, I mentioned that a little bit earlier. Some of the restrooms did not have clear accessible spaces to each of the amenities. I mean, I know a lot of, when we started the project, everyone called our attention to some of the restrooms in City Hall. I think that's a good example of an older restroom that might have some deficiencies there in terms of design. And then pretty consistently, we saw that curb ramp flares, and I'll show some pictures of what that involves, did not meet design requirements. So a certain component there of a curb ramp. Just to show what we're talking about, when we're talking about access aisles, that's my colleague Mara taking some measurements right there, but the access aisle is the portion of, it's right next to the parking space where people can access their vehicle. Looking at some inconsistencies in grading and width when we looked at a lot of parking lots. Insufficient access to bathroom features. So when I talk about insufficient access, we're thinking of having a sufficient width and turning movement for a person using a mobility device or a wheelchair to be able to access all of the features. So sink handles, flush handles, grab handles, things like that, and to be able to get in and out of the facility effectively. Curb ramps, very common. I will say we are in Oshkosh. I'm in Minnesota. We deal with freeze thaw. We have winter conditions. We have one of the biggest issues that really you can't hope to have it 100% solved at all times is pavement condition. But what we can do is look at pavement design. There's some portions of curb ramps that had flares, and I don't know if I have a way to, oh, here we go. I have a annotate here. This is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a flare of a curb ramp, those being a little bit too steep or the like. So that's just a quick overview of what we did. And then what I'd like to do is give a little presentation on what we did with all of that data and how we documented in terms of deficiencies, costs, et cetera. So one of the things that I want to say before I get into these results, I don't know for this group whether we're meeting the expectations when you look at some of the costs or numbers of deficiencies, but I want to say as a person who's done these types of reviews in well over a dozen communities in in the Midwest. The city of Oshkosh is performing very well in terms of maintenance and development of accessible features. I wanted to make sure I made that clear. It's commendable to the department heads and city staff that are charged with designing these items. It was evident to us that there was a lot of care taken to incorporate accessible features and designs. So even though when we see like some relatively low percentages in terms of compliance or like a long list of deficiencies, I would say in my limited experience that the city performs quite well when we're looking at this. There are also, we did notice that a lot of the different features do reflect very recent changes in ADA standards and compliance areas. So that's very good, and it's honestly something we often don't see. And I just want to emphasize that the city has a great deal of flexibility in how it moves toward implementation and ADA compliance. That's something that I'm working with John and his colleagues on into how we finalize this document and how we want to phrase everything. So just to give an example of what we looked at when we reviewed a public building, here's an example of when we went to the public library, some of what we looked at. So we looked at the approach and entrance to a facility, access to goods and services, and then the restrooms. So approach and entrance includes parking, access routes, so how people get in and out of buildings. Access to goods and services would be if you're going to a service counter, how you get to and from a seating area, looking at signage, elevators, ramps. And then we do spend a lot of time looking at restrooms because that's a common place where you have to have a lot of accessible features. Grab handles, how a toilet stall or toilet room is designed, things like that. We took a lot of measurements, photos, and everything. So I'm giving an example here of a public library just to show what deficiencies we found there. So with the approach and entrance, there were some issues with grading in the parking lot, curb ramp slopes, some issues with sign heights, and a door vestibule that was not a sufficient size to that had those turning movements and routes that were wide enough for someone using a wheelchair or other mobility device. Looking at some access to goods and services, there was some slope issues with an interior ramp, placement of railings. Even we really did look at everything. That an elevator label needs a star indicator for the ground level. If you think about how elevator buttons are labeled, that is part of ADA. Again, as I mentioned, some of the force to open doors was a little bit too heavy for someone that might have some physical limitations as to how much weight they can push. And then also looking at the types and designs of door handles that can be shown that are used. So just to show what some of those things mean, when I'm looking at a railing, that railing length must go out a little bit past the landing of a ramp. So we showed a photo of that here. And then some of the steepness and the angles of a curb ramp toward the access aisle at a parking spot, as well as a sign height that I believe is placed a little bit too low. Getting a little bit ahead of myself there. And an example of a park that we looked at all of the same things that we do in parks that we did in buildings, but then we also added some other access features. Looking at the drinking fountains, different requirements for team sports, play areas and playgrounds, changing rooms, swimming pools, fishing and boating access, and then a list of other things that we look at when we look at some of those park features. And I'm just pulling the example here from Stevens Park as one that we looked at. So in terms of some deficiencies that we saw at Stevens Park, looking at condition of pavement and striping, looking at cross slopes on the sidewalk that might be that are steep beyond what we would consider acceptable for ADA, looking at having sufficient accessible seating in a picnic area, some issues with signage, having a level area in front of things like water fountain signage, entrances, things like that. And then looking at some of those other access features that are specific to parks. There are areas like a transfer area where someone would, where a child would need to be lifted onto a playground feature. Some of those were too high. That doesn't necessarily mean you need to replace your playground equipment. It could just mean you need to add a little bit more wood chips or surface to get that up a little bit higher. That's another one that is very common as kids use playgrounds that kind of make impressions and the the surface settles. The different the heights of some of the steps were a little bit too high, and as well as the handles on some of the door heights on the tennis court, as well as, again, cross slopes on accessible routes and path areas. So this is just an example of some of the things that we looked at when we dug into some of the parks. And again, just to show some photographs here, there's my colleague Matt taking a measurement of that transfer area and noting that it's a little bit too high when you're looking at some of the play features. Here's another example of the restrooms there where the signage is on the door and not next to the door. There's some missing signage on the wall there, as well as looking at a water fountain that is protruding a little bit too far out and is a little bit too high up off the ground so as that it can't actually be detected by someone that's navigating with a cane. So we collected a lot of this data. It's available in a lengthy series of tables and spreadsheets. And then ultimately, we needed to put a cost and a series of priorities that city staff can then use moving forward. So how does the city of Oshkosh prioritize projects for bringing them into ADA compliance? Obviously, one thing you could do is just do it all at once in some sort of citywide initiative. I would say that that is uncommon. I've never worked in a community where that's the case. It's almost always phased in over time. So what we did when we looked at this data is we identified some of those items that we believe are low cost or maintenance activities, things that can probably be done by building or park custodial staff, changing out a doorknob or adjusting the location of a sign. That's not something that we would necessarily say you need a standalone capital project for. We also looked at, and it's something that could be done very easily. Like on day one when we conclude this project, a lot of these things can be taken care of in a fairly straightforward manner. Then we look at some other factors. So geography, where is it located and what is the frequency of use of the facility? Obviously something that gets used on a daily basis, like a public library versus an only occasionally used community room or a firehouse or something like that where limited public use. You'd want to prioritize those areas that have higher frequency of use over one that is less frequent. We also say it's a good idea to prioritize entry and access points. Can someone get in and out of a building? There is, in addition to physical design and building features, there's a human element to this too. Once someone is inside of a building, they may be able to seek assistance from a city employee or someone else that can help them out if there are other more secondary obstacles. Then also there's community input that's provided. One of the requirements of an ADA transition plan is that you have a formal complaint or grievance procedure. And we always leave it up. We always say that it's flexible and up to the city that we work in, how they want to prioritize projects if there is someone that provides input that we need to really meet some individual needs. And then we also look at things that are just a good idea from the perspective of project scoping. So if you're already doing a renovation project that where it just makes sense because of economies of scale to do some other accessibility improvements at the same time, we recommend that as well as a way you prioritize projects. So when we're putting together the cost estimates here, and hopefully if you can't read this on the screen, it's available in the packet in front of you, we divided those costs into those elements that we call minor corrections, so things that can be done by facility staff, very straightforward. We also divided out those improvements that are specific to approaches and entrances, and then we broke out the rest of the improvements when we're looking at the cost estimates and totals here. So as you can see, our total facility cost, for example, for the Oshkosh Public Library, again, rough estimates, not formal engineers' estimates. We also add a 30% contingency here if necessary. It's about $37,000 based on our experience to bring it into ADA compliance. But we say 900 of that is stuff that can be done basically by existing operational staff. $26,600 of that is for approaches and entrances. So maybe your higher priority item. And then the rest of it is this $9,500 that is maybe some more interior areas, things that are that you might want to prioritize as like your second priority. Similarly, we did the same thing with the parks. So looking at approaches and entrances, minor corrections that can be done by facility staff, and then all of the other items. In this example, Stevens Park, we identified about $29,600 in improvements. So again, conclusions, I want to give credit where credit is due to a lot of the city staff. It was interesting for us to see a lot of the newer accessible features that were put into some of the buildings. We wanted to just say that a lot of designers have kept up with changes to accessibility standards. And those standards are things that we are providing to you as an appendix to this document. So as future improvements are made, you have some reference material that you can look at. We're working actively with the city right now to hash out the details, how we're prioritizing projects, and document that in an implementation plan. So that concludes my presentation. I believe the only other items in the executive summary that I would want to note, we do just provide the grand total of improvements there. So, you know, we looked at for public buildings, again, not including contingency, about $705,000 of improvements. And then also for the parks, about another $500,000. And again, that's not saying that a check needs to be written right away. These are things that we're developing a phased improvement plan in a way that makes the most sense for the city. So again, thank you for your time, and I am happy to answer any questions that the commission may have.
Yes, I do have some questions. I'm just kind of curious why under our public buildings, we did not include the central garage, the parks building, our common council chambers, for example, and meeting spaces. I suppose that would just fall under City Hall, that specifically. And then, you know, Pollock Pool, restrooms, and especially transit stops, because we, as of at least several years ago, we did not have the concrete pads for boarding and deboarding our buses. And I just was hoping you might speak to that.
So I'll answer the first part there. With regard to City Hall, we did look at all of the accessible routes and access points within City Hall. So basically going down every hallway, looking at getting into chambers, every meeting room. Once you're in the rooms, especially if there's flexible seating and things like that, we did not find any deficiencies as long as people can get in and maneuver to a spot. There were no compliance issues there. Some of the buildings that you mentioned, I will say that we focused only on those, again, that had a public use, so that are accessible to the public. If it was strictly a maintenance facility or garage, or we had our initial list had a lot of things like sewer lift stations. Those were not reviewed because they don't fall under Title II of ADA. Bus stops, as well as sidewalks, curb ramps, signals, that falls under public right-of-way, which again was not under the scope of this project. It was just focusing on buildings and park facilities. So that is, and I can certainly defer to John and his colleagues to speak to that, but I believe that is being covered under a separate initiative. We typically consider bus stops to be a portion of the public right-of-way, which was excluded from this project.
So did you have an opportunity to look at the plans for the parks building, since that is a publicly accessible civic building?
I'm not sure that we looked at plan sets or like future, or are you talking about like a planned building?
Are you talking about the
Yes.
current building or the?
Either or.
Well, the current building, we didn't waste our time on because we're
Right,
doing a new
right.
building. And the new building's required to have those features because that's the current requirement. We're looking at all these other buildings because they're essentially all grandfathered in, but we need to assess them according to the way the law is written.
So since this was only the Title II, and those transit stops specifically don't fall under this scope, was it staff's plan to add that on to this discussion, or?
Yeah, that's another piece that we would have to do. It would include work that would encompass James Robbie's area too in Public Works. So that would be a pretty huge undertaking for us to focus on all right-of-way. And we thought that we'd take that in another chunk because this was focused primarily on facilities.
And since so did I understand this correctly? Title II is only regarding public access. So I
Correct.
guess I was thinking of it from the standpoint of employees or potential employees also. So that's under a different section then?
Yes, right.
Okay.
Title II is just public access to our public facilities.
Okay, thank you.
And if I may answer, so public right-of-way is included under Title II of ADA. I just want to make that clarification. We did not look at, as was mentioned, we did not look at public right-of-way under the scope of this project. That's being covered in a separate initiative. What you're referring to is for city employees, that would be under Title III, and that's more related to employment law and making reasonable accommodations for staff. Again, that's less about the physical environment and more about city regulations and programs. And we did not review that as part of this project.
Councilmember Ford.
Yeah, thank you. So when we say deficient, we mean out of compliance with the current statute, and the projects can be grandfathered in, and under Title II, if I'm understanding this, we have to go about this study. But then what are the requirements in terms of actually mitigating and following through on the recommendations?
Do you want to speak to that, Joe, or I can?
Whichever you prefer.
It's my understanding that, just as Joe mentioned initially, that we're required to have a plan. We're required to evaluate everything that we have and then have a demonstrated plan to move forward.
Okay.
And that's really what we have. And we've had initial dialogue with our departments. But I think Joe did a really good job speaking to the prioritization and how we need to move forward.
Yeah.
One of the things that he said to us that I don't think he mentioned to the council was trying to look at Title II really in three dimensions: the approach, the entry, and then the internal. And he did a real good job explaining it to us by saying if he were to suggest a prioritization, he would suggest it in that same sequence too, because it doesn't matter what's happening on the inside if you can't get to the building, and then it doesn't matter what's happening on the inside if you can't get into the building. So I think, and Joe, you can expand upon that, but I thought that was really a practical way to look at it in terms of the sequence, other than, as he mentioned, and the departments are very eager to work on things that are just very quick, low-hanging fruit kind of initiatives that we can just take care of pretty quickly. Anything else, Joe, that I missed?
No, I think that's a very good summary of how I'd frame the prioritization. One of the things I would just add to that is it's challenging for us as well as reviewers is that you don't get any partial credit for ADA. So if something is mostly compliant, even if, for example, a curb ramp, if there's just one feature of it that is a little bit off or a little bit too steep, it's technically a non-compliant feature. So hopefully that nuance is contained in the data that we provided to the city. But yes, and one other thing I would mention is that there are, so I think if you're referring to something that's like a historic building, where it would be a significant undertaking to make it fully accessible. There are clauses within ADA related to the scope of the project. If you're spending greater than 20% of a project cost to bring it into ADA compliance, then you don't need to, then that's a way that something can be grandfathered in if it's an older facility or something like that. But that's kind of taken on a case-by-case basis when you're scoping a renovation project or something like that.
Thank you, really helpful.
Yep. Fitz, I've got a question if everybody's done.
Sure. Mayor, is
Yes,
that
go
okay?
ahead, Councilmember Miller.
Thank you, Mayor. Fitz, I guess I have one question for you, and then I've got one question for Joe. Fitz, how many complaints do we get about accessibility, both internally and externally? Give me an idea, put this in perspective for myself and everybody else.
Historically, I mean, since I've been here, we haven't had a significant number of complaints. And I know John works with that specifically. But we try to, as Joe mentioned, we try to anticipate items and we try to mitigate those as quickly as we can. One that comes to mind, I think, that it was probably more of a safety issue, and Paul Greener, our safety officer's here tonight too, but rather than an ADA issue, was the approach to City Hall, the ramp, the entrance to City Hall. So we spent a significant amount of time on that, studying it, updating it, trying to make it as safe as we possibly could. But the short answer is we haven't had a lot of complaints.
Okay. Joe, my second question is for you. First of all, thank you. I think this was very thorough. And kudos to the department heads for being this far ahead. I thought we'd be a little bit more deficient than what we are, but that's great news. So Joe, given the scale, scope, and the amount of money to solve our ADA problems, traditionally and historically, what have you seen with other communities in timelines for a city like Oshkosh to solve these problems? And be as vague as you need to be, but and I hate to throw out questions that I didn't give ahead of time, so I'm kind of throwing you under the bus. But I'm looking, and I think council members are probably looking, what's the rest of the real world doing in terms of a time horizon to solve these deficiencies?
And I will try to, I think, by the regulations, I have to be vague because the law is vague in that you're not held to a certain timeline. I mean, the law says, well, it was enacted in 1990 and you had 2 years to implement it. But what I would say is it's all about how you prioritize it. And we look to develop something that is consistent with your own capital improvement program. And where you want to deviate from that is thinking about exactly as what was said before. Maybe looking at, we want to fast track our building entrances and accessible routes and parking lots and things like that. I would say, our time frame that I've typically put in ADA transition plans is in the ballpark of 10 to 20 years to achieve ADA compliance. I'm hesitant to prescribe that. It is very much up to each individual city situation and how many how many issues they have and how many challenges we identify. But that's probably what I would say is a reasonable ballpark. But what we try to do is identify in this plan what some of those higher priority items are, and then also the low-hanging fruit that you can result. If it's just a matter of signage and doorknobs, that's what I love to tell cities. Like, that's it. If you just fix that, I mean, you might have a whole building that is compliant, and there's not a lot of earth that might need to get moved for some of those. Parking lot grading, curb ramps, anything with concrete, that can be a little bit more costly. And you probably want to do, like I said, if you're doing some type of adjacent roadway or streets project, and you can take advantage of scoping some other accessibility improvements into that, that's something that I would do in concert with like your public works department to take advantage of what you can do when you scope a project to bring something into ADA compliance. So hopefully that was a sufficient non-answer
I guess I
City
would,
manager?
I would add to that, there was, on page 5 and 6 of the executive summary, the numbers are summarized. And I think if you just take a practical approach to, if we were going to say, for example, a very small building, Station 18. Now granted, even with a 30% contingency, it's only $17,000. But if we were going to be making some improvements over there, chances are we would probably just get those out of the way because they're relatively small. There is that subtotal that Joe put together with the minor corrections. Those are things that John Urban's facility staff are going to look at and say, are there little things we can do within our, just in our, just wandering around doing little projects that we can add a few things. So we're going to take a very practical approach. Now, you take a look at some of the larger buildings. For example, the convention center, the first one on the list, is actually the most expensive one at $325,000. As we do some improvements over there, working with the convention center, we're going to look and say, are some of these things, do they need to get done? We know, for example, that we did not do a lot of the island improvements, the exterior, that landscaped raised island. And I think that's one of the areas where we have some deficiencies, if I'm not mistaken. So as we look at doing that island, we'll probably knock those out anyway. So I think we have to just take a very common sense approach and not say, oh my gosh, we got $1.6 million that we need to set aside specifically. I think we just take a methodical approach. A good analogy to that is we have a sidewalk program. And people, every once in a while, the city gets sued for somebody tripping on a sidewalk. Generally, we have a 10-year program that we demonstrate. We're planning to be in Mr. Ford's neighborhood in this year and Ms. Erickson's in another year. And as long as we are methodically going through our program, we're generally covered. So if somebody came in and pointed something out, like I think that's what Mr. Miller was referring to, have we had many complaints? No. But when we do, we try to address them. The big ones, the tricky ones, are things, and the mayor and I have talked about this one, the bathrooms here at City Hall. The first floor bathrooms are just not.
Not handicapped.
They're not handicapped
Wheelchair accessible,
No,
for sure.
so the only handicapped accessible restroom we have is right here on the 4th floor, and that's what we use. That's been sufficient for us so far, but if it started to become a bigger problem, we would probably have to address that. But again, we start poking at things in this building, we know that we have a $15 million price tag that's about a 5-year-old price tag on redoing this building. That would get rid of all of those issues, but are we gonna spend $15 million to fix City Hall, which is about $97,000? We have to be very practical about how we do that. Hope that answers that general question. John Urban, next steps. Where do you see this going?
Well, I
Because
think,
that's really, generally, we come back within 30 days of a workshop, and 30 days will be the next meeting, actually, but where we plan to go with this information.
well, we just shared it with the department heads last week as well, and I think we want to give them time to digest it and look at it and offer input. And then I think we want to sit back down, Mark, with you and go through the priorities and kind of sort of shore that up and get that moving. I believe money's been set aside in the CIP, correct?
Some money has been set aside in the CIP, yeah.
I think there's money set aside there. So I think we would look at, like Joe had laid out, the various priorities that you have here, approaches, entrances, the minor corrections. What of those can we do in-house? What of those would we work with the department, see if they have folks in-house that can deal with that? Do we want to put any of these together and do the economies of scale and try to maybe address some of these priorities, like the public works type of work, et cetera? So I think we're on our way, but I think there's still some more fine tuning that needs to be done.
And I guess I would ask too then, city manager, do you intend at some point to bring forth the right-of-way under another section? Because that, I think we should also have the discussion about the priority of those transit pads, and how do you see that being prioritized in this context?
I would say that would be a longer-term project, but I think Mr. Collins, in his review of different sites. We take more of the practical approach. If somebody says, this bus stop is somebody, and we have some disabled passengers that point out to us on a pretty regular basis, hey, I get off at this spot, this is a problem. We'll go out there and fix that, just because, but are we gonna fix everyone? Not necessarily, but we do listen to our transit riders to get input from them and try to do that. And I know Mr. Collins is here, and I don't wanna put him on the spot, but generally, that's the approach we've taken so that we're responsive, but not going overboard and spending all of it. But as we're doing streets, do we redo the ramps? Do we look at those things? We absolutely do. Jim, if you got anything to add?
Yeah,
to that.
that's correct. I mean, we have like 300 some bus stops, so to say that we would get all of them to be ADA accessible, that's not practical or realistic. However, we do listen, like Mark said, if somebody has a particular issue at a stop, we try to adjust those the best we can. And we did about, it's probably been 6-7 years now, but we did do an accessibility study of all our transit stops in the city. So we are aware of how accessible each one is. And some of
Yeah.
them are more, the heaviest usage stops generally have a shelter and or bench, and then they'll have the concrete pads that, which we call carriage walks. That's what you use the ramp for so that the wheelchair passengers can get to and from the stop. So when we look at that, we generally look at the highest usage stops, and then the stops, like Mark said, we either know that there are people that are disabled that use those stops, or if we get some input, we look at those as well.
And I personally was involved in doing the audit as an intern with East Central back in 2009, 2010. And I'm just curious how many we've actually done since that time.
Sure.
That prevent folks who might use it, were they there? Just
Yep.
curious how many we've been
Yeah,
doing.
we generally, we allocate $10,000 a year in the CIP to transit stop accessibility improvements.
Okay.
And that's what we use that for. So generally, we add, I would say on average, about 2 shelters a year, which would include the concrete pads and/or benches, depending on the stops.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think if, as you said, you had a study done, maybe you could supplement, even if it's dated, maybe you could just supplement us with that information. It'd probably be appropriate in terms of the whole package that we're attempting to look at, right?
Sure.
And then it seems logical that for Mr. Urban and his crew and in terms of budgeting, to run something, if we're gonna, and we should address, several of these things, to run it similar to how you do the HVAC and the roofing, and you just like Jim mentioned, it's an allotment, and you bite off as much as you can chew, and you prioritize yourselves. It seems logical.
That'd be great. I'm glad you mentioned that, and we'd like to have that flexibility to work on it once we get the plan firmed up. One additional item I'd just like to mention, in addition to transit, we talked to the departments preliminarily about this, and for example, Public Works, when they work with contractors to work on some of the street projects, Joe mentioned that some of the curb cuts were the slope was a little off. Now that, we have that familiarity, in speaking with James, he talked about the idea of incorporating that a little more fervently in the specs for our contractors when they're working on those curb cuts. So I think just that awareness and making sure that that's communicated to our employees, so when they're working on these projects with different contractors, we'll be able to make improvements on the fly as well, prospectively going forward. So I think that's really a good outcome of this project.
And as the council's aware, this was part of an offshoot of our facilities studies and what council had asked me to do for this year. So I think also the next step is to, take a look at these, looking at our facilities, and have a discussion. And it's really coming down to, how are we going to finance? Because we got a lot of facilities that we've got on the docket in the CIP already, but there's others, for example, this building, that has a very high price tag and a dated price tag. I like to point out, it's a 5-year-old price tag, but, what are we going to do? And I think that's where council was like, this is ultimately going to be a debt management issue, and how do we do these? So I think Deputy Mayor Mugarauer said, maybe some of these we can just kind of do like HVAC, put an allowance into our CIP to knock out some of these ones that are on page 5 and 6. And I think that's probably a good approach for those. The bigger ones, that's going to be a different issue, but I think we're going to be coming back now that we did this study and the facility study, probably a separate workshop just for that, but we'll talk about that first of the year.
And just one other small follow-up, and that was, I noticed that the public museum, there was like a small amount, it was like $13,800 for entrances. But you and I just had this conversation, and I've had some personal experience with a family member in wheelchair, and that lift, it seems like a rather small amount to address the accessibility in the museum entrance area. Is that?
Well, it's a question of, we could, but we are also looking at redoing the museum entrance in general, because there's a lot of inconveniences that are built in, and I don't want to get Ms. Phillips all worked up that she's got a deficient building. It's a dated building, and there are things that we could do to improve. When we have a school group, and I don't think Sarah's seen one yet, when we have a school group, it's very difficult. You're pointing out another situation where, it's only a couple feet to raise it to that level, but it's a very
It's a
awkward.
very cumbersome and not dignified way to access the museum.
But if we redid the entrance, all those issues would get addressed, because once we redo an area, everything's got to get risen up to ADA standards. So those are the issues. Do we spend money to do what you're suggesting, or do we wait until we get that done in a few years? Like the Parks building, once that gets built, those issues are going to magically disappear. So that's where I think we'll be looking at after the first of the year, is it's really going to be a debt management issue. But that's all we have tonight.
All right,
Good.
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.